Do you know how many trees are in your yard? Or on your block? Biologist Beronda Montgomery would encourage you to count them, and maybe even get to know them. She has 33 trees at her home. Trees, she says, should not merely be the background to our lives. We should engage with them and even learn from them. In her book, When Trees Testify, Science, Wisdom, History, and America's Black Botanical Legacy, Beronda Montgomery explores the ways that 7 trees, as well as the cotton shrub, are intertwined with Black history and culture. Coming up on Afterwards, biologist Beronda Montgomery talks about an encounter with a 600-year-old oak tree, her earliest science experiments, and her efforts to pass botanical knowledge from her grandparents and parents down to her own children. This is Afterwards from C-SPAN. This week, biologist Beronda Montgomery talks about Black history in America through the lens of trees and the African Americans who cultivated and lived alongside them. She sat down with University of New Hampshire physics professor Chanda Prescott Weinstein at the Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts in February of 2026.
So I'm going to start by saying that hi, I'm Chanda, and it's an incredible honor to be in conversation with Beronda, who is someone that I've really looked up to in my career and has been someone whose path I have watched and tried to follow. So I just want to say it's an honor to be asked to be in conversation with you, Beronda. And this book is remarkable. And it's remarkable in its range. So I think people heard a little bit of summary about that. It is a science book. I think this is really important when we're talking about classing books by Black scientists. That genre can be a bit of a struggle.
Yes.
It's a science book, but it's also a Black history book. It is both, and it's full of personal essay. And it's different from Lessons from Plants. So I'm wondering if you could talk about how you decided that this was the book you wanted to write at this stage in your incredibly accomplished scientific career.
First of all, thank you for being here. Chanda's one of the people I'll keep writing books for, to be in conversation with. We got to have a conversation about Lessons from Plants, but it was virtual, so it's a gift to be with you today. That's an interesting question, because after Lessons from Plants, in many ways, I think people were looking for the next Lessons from Plants and were expecting, and I do have another global diasporic Lessons from Plants that I feel brewing. But at the time that I was writing this book, writing Lessons from Plants actually, my father passed away, and then I was traveling with my sister and son, my sister, best friend, and son, who are Black African American history geeks. And at some point I started to ask myself, what was my unique purpose on the planet as a Black plant scientist? Mm-hmm. And certainly Lessons from Plants is a Black feminist perspective on plant science, so that was also a unique place. But it also felt like we were in a time where our country continues to want to erase our history. And I wanted to make sure that while I was still on the planet, I wrote the things that I thought I was uniquely positioned to write. And an encounter with about 600-year-old tree, in the moment of being with that tree and recognizing that tree would have been alive, this was on the site of a plantation, would have been there when people were enslaved, that I understood the science of the tree and was connected to it. I just saw my science, African American history, and personal family stories come together in a way in that tree that drew me into writing in this direction.
Wow.
Thank you.
Just to pull on one of those threads, one of the things I've been noticing over the last couple of weeks is I've been trying to tell people about the book.
Thank you so much for that.
I'm just trying to be the street team, yes. Is how much relevance everything that I read in the book has to literally daily news stories. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of those connections you're seeing to what's going on in the outside world, yes, and what it's like to be kind of having these conversations with audiences as all of that is unfolding in relation to this book that you spent years working on.
It's been, I don't even know if I have the word for it. I think in some days, so I go from days of being thankful that I have a lens through which I can connect with people and talk. I have days where, to be quite frank, I'm pissed off that there are so many resonating connections between what I wrote about in history and what's happening in today. And it took me back to after George Floyd was murdered, I saw my, at the time, 17-year-old son having conversations with his 70-year-old great uncles about their common experiences in the US. And I thought, those are moments that I don't know how to wrap my mind around it. So in terms of the book, in the past weeks, as we've been watching Liam with the little blue bunny hat, the 5-year-old, basically kidnapped off the streets by his own government and taken away somewhere and then coming back, I immediately went to the Willow chapter where I talk about this massacre in Elaine, Arkansas. So in 2019, I was a professor at Michigan State when I saw a story about a tree, a willow tree in Arkansas that had a memorial willow tree that had been desecrated. And I see Arkansas and willow tree, and I'm like, trees in Arkansas, I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas, I see a connection. And this particular tree had been planted to commemorate a 100-year-old massacre that had happened in Elaine, Arkansas. And as I started to listen to it, I'm like, my grandfather was born in that town. And as we started to do the math, he was 5 years old in this town, the largest anti-Black massacre in Arkansas history. And so we had not known that my grandfather at 5 had lived through this event. So when I saw Liam with the bunny hat, I thought about my grandfather and thought, this country is still terrorizing 5-year-olds, right? Like, what kind of country are we that we won't take care of our youth? So those kinds of instances. And then today, sometimes I hate to speak of it because it's ridiculous, but when we're seeing a president that posts an anti-Black racist video about the president, I go to the Poplar chapter where so frequently in the lives of African Americans, we get hit with these tropes that stem back to enslavement and before, where you just, have to constantly grapple with the fact that, in my own words, I'm not putting words in your mouth, inhumane people want to continue to question our humanity. And so it's like this constant thread of life. And so there's so many instances in the book when I just think there are these resonating histories that continue to come forward because we won't tell the truth about who we are and grapple with our history in a way.
You have me thinking about the title, When Trees Testify. Yes. So I guess just kind of as a writing nerd, as a fellow writer, I really want to know how you arrived on this title. Was there a generative moment? Were you brainstorming? No,
so it's maybe it's a gift or a curse. I usually have the title of my book before I've even written the book proposal, right? So when I was, okay, good. Yeah, so it was about 2018 or 2019. So Lessons from Plants came out in 2021. When I was at this formative moment with this 600-year-old oak tree, that was in around 2019. At the McLeod plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. And I talk about this in the book, but I didn't want to go. I am not really drawn to go to those places because I believe in taking ethical visits to historical places, and I wasn't sure what the other visitors there were going to bring to the table. But my sister, son, and I take trips together, and I gave birth to this son and raised him, and he always sides with my sister. It's kind of like, So I had chosen something to do the day before, Botanical Gardens, and their choice was to visit a couple plantations. So I really didn't want to go. It was going to rain. I welcomed the rain. I tried to do rain dances. It just didn't work out. And when we got there, because my son is thoughtful, he started to try to point out plants and trees that might draw me out. And as he was pointing out this huge tree, the cultural guide said this tree is estimated to be 400 to 600 years old. So I became truly fascinated with it and thinking about the fact that how awesome it is that we could stand with the same living being, like a material living witness, as Taya Miles talks about trees. And I was fascinated with that, but then offhanded, I said, the tree holds the captured breath of our ancestors, right? Because photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water makes glucose. You put the glucose in a chain, you have cellulose, and you have wood. And so then I was walking off, and I looked back, and Nicholas and Renee were speechless at the same time. This does not happen frequently. And so she said, no, you have to say that again. And I said, yeah, it holds the captured breath of our ancestors in the foundational rings, and now our breath can join theirs in the new rings. So let's stop and breathe intentionally. And, you know, Renee said that I can't wrap my head around that. And in history in the US, these trees have been talked about as witness trees, trees that have witnessed experiences. But for me, testify is a step beyond witnessing. So in court, you testify, you bring your witness and share it to try to engender justice. I grew up in a Black church tradition. They used to have what they call testifying or testimony service, and people would bring their witness to the collective, either for prayer or for rejoicing. And so for me, the ability to understand the science of the trees that would take a fact of carbon dioxide to wood as captured breath of ancestors felt like an invitation for me to bring my scientific knowledge and my own journey of kind of figuring out what it meant for me to be a Black botanist, past witnessing to testifying. And so that's how I got to When Trees Testify.
I just think the way that your voice is so poetic.
I wanted to be a poet.
I mean, I think you are, right? I think that that's part of what comes through in the book, and I think one of, I guess reading again for form, one of the challenges I saw with the book is figuring out how to tell those stories and hold on to your sense of wonder. And make sure that the reader can walk through that history and that difficulty, but also walk in your wonder and with your wonder, and maybe find some of their own. And so I'm wondering how you navigated that as part of your writing process of just, and I don't know if you were having if it was both on the same day, or some days you were doing one, some days you were doing the other. And whether there was an audience you had that you visualized to kind of help guide you through that process.
That's a great question. So my audience in my mind became my grandfather, who I felt really, I felt sad that I didn't get to know this history before he passed away so I could talk with him about it. But my audience has also been my mother, who is still alive and well physically, but in the beginning of dementia. And so I thought to myself, what stories would I want to capture that the ancestor, my grandfather that I know, and my living mother would be super proud of? And the one thing I love about my mom, she has a green thumb and loves plants. So when she gets a new leaf, we almost have to stop and have a party because she got a new Monstera leaf. And so she still has this kind of wonder. And so they were my family kind of memory, people I wanted. But also I think a lot, in fact, it's interesting because I talk about both your work and my work in this next answer to the question. I also think about Black girls who want to do Black justice work, but thinks that means they have to be historians or sociologists. And I often talk about how proud I am that I can point to names and examples of Black women who've taken a path toward doing Black feminist work through a physics lens, right? Or through botany. And so those are the kind of voices that I think about audience. But one of the things that I did, and you know, as writers, the relationship you have with agents and editors are so critically important. When my agent and I were deciding on the editor for this book, he said, I think we should go for someone who's done fiction or lots of non-narrative fiction. And I said, I don't get it. I don't think so. I'm not sure where you're going. And he said, you know, there are a couple of personal stories, and I think that those personal stories are going to become so critical to linking the science to the history to the current reader. And so I did work with an editor, Retha Powers, who herself has written fiction. She now primarily works in non-narrative fiction, but the questions that she would ask really brought it to the level that is now, because I kept leaning away from the personal stories. I've never wanted to do anything close to memoirish. I'm like, I don't have anything exciting in my life, and yet I'm deeply private about the non-exciting life I have. So it was that combination.
I mean, I will say I think it worked. That's some of the most powerful storytelling in terms of understanding you even in thinking about a story that I'm going to come back to later, but thinking of like baby Beronda, the scientist, like the baby scientist, and getting to see how a Black woman scientist creates herself. And I think that that's part of the story. I guess just staying on the form thing, sorry everyone, I really love talking to writers about how they write. But staying on the form thing, one of the things I noticed was the way that you weave in the chapters, that you move from the personal to the scientific to the historical, and not necessarily in a, now I'm doing history, now I'm doing personal, now I'm doing science, and it's not linear. Mm-hmm. And so I really looked at that and was like, that was hard. So I'm just, again, wondering, like, how did you make those decisions about what order are these paragraphs going to go in? Because this is a story that you could have told very differently, and it would have been a very different book.
You know what's so interesting about that is when I sent the first draft in, so I decided to write it in the way that made sense to me, because I don't see myself as a Black woman mother when I'm with my son, and a scientist when I'm in the lab, and I'm that person all the time. Right? And so I said, I'm going to write it the way it makes sense to me, and then the editor will rearrange it. And I remember when I sent it to her, I was almost disappointed. She said, the form is great. Mm-hmm. I said, well, why is it great? And she said, no, it makes sense. And she moved very few things. Mm-hmm. She said, you followed the logic of your mind about how you got to the place that you are. And I think the one thing that I was hoping, and how the form, it was kind of organic, but part of it is that I said to myself, I want to tell the story the way it makes sense to me that I came to be. And there is this constant going back and forth. I don't even know now if it's in this book or Lessons from Plants, but I almost set my mom's bathroom on fire when I was 4 doing experiment, right? And then I'm germinating seeds. So I was always this curious scientist, and that's a thread of who I am. But the history part, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to so weave the history in like a quilt with the personal stories is that we try to do the very opposite of that in our world every day. Mm. We try to take our history out and say, no, we are not who our ancestors were 2 generations ago. And I wanted to show how those things are it really is quilted together and braided together and weaved together. So I'm glad the form worked. Because I just did what made sense to me. And now one of my colleagues who he's an MFA writing instructor, he's like, we're going to use this in memoir class. I said, are you sure that's, and he said, I'm absolutely sure. So, yeah. Follow your instincts sometimes.
I like that, that it was really about instincts.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to biologist Beronda Montgomery talking about her book, When Trees Testify.
So there were a couple of stories that really stayed with me in the book. So one of them is the story of Antoine, the enslaved man who domesticated pecan trees. And that's why we have pecan pie. So if you had pecan pie over Thanksgiving. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about that story. And I was actually curious, a lot of the stories you tell, one of the things that we don't always get is when did you learn this story and sort of the backstory of your process of arriving at it. And so I'm curious about when you learned that story, because it's also one that comes very early in the book and kind of sets the tone for what comes afterwards.
Yes. So, it's hard for me to remember when I first heard the story of Anton. I want to believe, so I had a Ford Fellowship, which was a community of for supporting PhD people working on PhDs or moving into the professorate from underrepresented backgrounds. And amongst the community, about 75% of people were in social science and history. Scientists were very few. I believe it was at one of the conferences, someone in history asked me if I'd ever heard of Anton. But more recently, it's been brought back. So Taya Miles talks about Anton in her book, All That She Carried, when she's talking about Ashley's sack, because there were pecans in the sack. And I remember while I was writing this book, I saw a talk that Taya gave here on campus for something, and she said, I've always wanted to sit down with a scientist who understands the science of pecan trees and talk about that. And I thought, just wait 6 months or something. So I don't remember, and I hate that I didn't get to ask my mother, because when I wrote Lessons from Plants and someone asked me about when I first remembered the 3 sisters, I'm telling them a story, and a week later my mom faxes me a coloring page from kindergarten. She said, no, we did this in kindergarten. So mom might know before, family may have shared it before, but pecans were so important to me because my mother and father, who, just as a side note, have one of the cutest love stories I've ever heard of. So my grandmothers were best friends, and they wanted to be related. So they wanted two of their children to marry, and they had tried with two of their other children, and that was a disaster. But my parents, it stuck, right? So they were raised in the same area in pecan groves. And so pecan was definitely going to be a part of the story, and immediately I knew that Antoine would be a part of the history of grounding that in the history.
You know, when I was reading that section, I was thinking about other friends of mine who are from Black Southern families that also have similar relationships with pecan groves.
Yes.
And also, you know, the opening section where you talk about your visit to the plantation.
Yes.
And I think I have a very similar relationship to that. And in particular in South Carolina, in Charleston, there's the Drayton plantation.
Yes.
I don't know if that's one of the ones you
Yes.
visited. And I remember figuring out just a few years ago that people have like events there.
Yes.
And my great-grandmother was a Drayton. I am in Barbados because their family, the South Carolina family, owned my family. And so I think part of what was powerful for me in reading the book was connecting with these stories, even when sometimes they weren't the exact same family stories, but recognizing ones that were similar, of going through that process of what is my relationship to this plantation going to be?
Yes.
Which I think I will now have a different journey should I ever decide to visit that one because of the story you tell in the introduction. And so I'm wondering how you thought about the responsibility that you were taking on in framing those stories, particularly for your Black readers who were going to have a different experience reading them because of our own family histories.
Yeah. I thought about that a lot because this is also a narrative that pops up in kind of popular culture over time. So I remember, it may even be 10 years ago now, when one of the bachelors, African-American guy, chose a white woman who had been involved in plantation parties during her sorority days and what the national conversation was. But as I was writing this book, also, there was a plantation that burned, the big house burned down. I write about it here. I'm just old.
Black Twitter had a good time with that one. I don't remember the name of it, but we had fun.
At that time, I remember Michael Twitty wrote an article about it, about him having mixed feelings, where there were a lot of people, a lot of Black people were celebrating, right? These are the ancestors, the chickens have come home to roost. And I remember in that moment having a conversation with my son, the 23-year-old, brilliant, just really, he holds me and his dad's feet to the fire about being ethical humans. And so he called me and said, you know, I'm watching people celebrate, and some said, where are you? And I said, you know, I am remembering what seeing the tree did for me, which led to writing this book. Michael Twitty talks about having visited former plantations and seeing the etchings in the wall and other things that led him to explore the history. So what I have understood is that there is a powerful place for ethical visitation of former plantation sites. And how do we get people to want to take an ethical visit there as opposed to have a wedding or a party there, is that we have to have more stories about how visiting these spaces can invite you into a greater appreciation for history, a greater visibility of history, but we have to be willing to have those conversations. So there are times when I completely understood people celebrating, because it's like our ancestors are not just sitting quiet. And then I also think what was lost there that someone like me or Michael won't get a chance to see, and bring it forward to a larger public. So I think we have to have conversations about how do we ethically honor the history of these spaces, which means that ownership has to change hands, right? And if we don't do that, maybe it's best that they're not there. But it's a so I don't judge you for celebrating at all.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think I'm still working through my feelings and the fact that this plantation of the people who own my family in a completely different place.
It's very different.
Is just one that people kind of traipse around having fun, having drinks. I think, a bizarre behavior.
That's why
right?
I didn't want to go. It was like, what are the other people going to be doing? And am I going to have to say something? And my sister always says, you don't ever have to say something. And I was like, well, I might have to say something. And so I said to them, if you take me, just know I might have to say something.
I'm glad we are cut from the same cloth.
I always say, if you don't want me to say it, don't do it. Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to ask you about the mulberry tree story. So I'm going to prep the audience a little bit by saying that this is a story that made me so angry that I wept, and then I went and told my spouse about it and wept. So
I'm glad you got it then.
Yes.
Got it.
I mean, I think part of it, again, coming back to, I have I'll say something about this afterwards. So talk to me about the story you tell about mulberry trees, and in particular, the experience that you had, but also your mother.
Yes. So for those who haven't had a chance to read it, I'll give a brief story. We grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, right? The site of the Little Rock Nine, where they had a pretty rough trying to segregate. So I came along, my sister and I, the youngest of 5 kids, were a part of a second generation of integrating schools in Little Rock. So we were bused from our working class black neighborhood into a primarily white school. And we made lots of friends because we're both friendly. And my mother learned at some point that being on the PTA was important for her kids. So she was on the PTA for 20 years, I think. So she made lots of friends. And I made a really good friend, all pseudonyms in the book. I made a really good friend, and we would play together. And at some point, we got close enough that we would visit each other's home. She spent the night at our home. I spent the night at her home. And my mother and her were very good friends. And one summer, the mother said, there's this great summer camp. You should make sure to sign up Renee and Beronda. And when I talked to my mother about this before her memory faded, she remembers the conversation felt very much like there's this summer camp we're sending our kids to. And on the first day we get there, Renee and I first of all, we get to the bus, it's only other African-American kids. Not surprising. We're like, this is the kids from our neighborhoods. Maybe when we get there, we'll see our friends. And when we get there, we don't see any of our friends. And we start to get this talk from the camp counselor about all of the things we're going to learn, how we're going to come out brighter, how they believe in us. They believe we can grow. And I love to share this part. There's not going to be any fighting. They're like, we're not going to have any fighting out of you. Now,
I wanted to be fighting with them when I got to
that part. If they
like,
knew me, I've never been a fighter. But my sister Renee is she is a rule follower. And so the thought of fighting, she said, oh my God, I didn't come here to fight, right? And so we started to hear this deficit narrative. Like, we believe in you, we're gonna teach you all of these things, you're gonna learn new tree names and new flower names. And I thought, it's very odd. All the counselors were young white girls and young white men. And at some point I said, I'm a good reader, I'm reading the sign, all the sponsors. And so we went home, and I said to my mom, they kept saying this is for, I forget the language I used, but the language they used was like, this is for needy kids or whatever.
I think it was underserved.
Underserved.
That's what it was?
So I went home to my mom, and I said, Mom, are black kids the only kids that are underserved? And she looked at Renee like, what happened today? I thought you guys were gonna go swimming. And she said, well, she named the 2 kids of our white friends' parents. I said they weren't there. So she went and called and said, what are these 2 kids doing this summer? And their mother named this really nice camp they were going to. And we went back each day, and there was all this just deficit narrative. And I came home quiet and withdrawn. And my mother thought, okay, maybe you just had so many activities that you're tired. And she said, did you have many activities? And I said, no. And my mother is, of all things, a fierce mama bear. And if I'm quiet and withdrawn and I'm not tired, there's a problem. And so, her sister looked at her like, I told you. And the one thing that I didn't put in this book is that this wasn't just the thing that happened to me. There are scholarly books published about how in the 70s and 80s, when there were some liberal white parents who wanted to pay for their black, kids who had black or Latina friends to go to their kids' summer camp, they were not going to have that. So a whole philanthropy arose to have camps for black kids so that they would be away. And I think in that moment, my mom realized that this person who she thought was her friend saw her kids as safe to interact with her children, but also saw a deficit in us that she would recommend that we go to this particular camp. And I just remember my mom doesn't get hurt or whatever. She was just so hurt by that. So then I was hurt. And I continued to have a friendship with this young woman, but over time there was just this kind of separation because no one wants to see their kids as someone's project. And the fact that it just wasn't me and Renee, but that this was a national lens of we're going to take on. And first of all, the camp guide didn't even know the right trees because I had learned the trees with my grandparents. She didn't even have it right. And so this idea that, and I just remember I was so hurt because they hurt my mother. My mother was hurt because of the way people were looking at her kids. And what I have learned, I never assume bad intentions. I believe that my friend's mother had good intentions, but in these United States of America, we have learned to prize white people's intentions over the impact of their intentions on others. And I wanted to write about the impact because I am very old now, but I remember that,
That's
right?
That's not true.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, okay. I appreciate you.
You're 25.
Yeah, I still look good. Okay.
Yes.
But I think I just wanted to invite people to think about intention. And when you're thinking about doing something like that, how would it have changed if that mother had asked herself, what is my intention of this, right? And I ask myself that a lot too. What is my intention of doing this thing? Because my intention may not have the impact that I intend. And I can only imagine the discipline my mother showed that we were all able to remain friends, because if someone had done that to my little Nicholas, I don't even know.
I mean, I think actually the interesting thing about the reaction that I had to that story was also really about the experience that your mother had.
Yes.
I think partly because it actually returned me to a moment from when I was doing my Frosh move-in weekend here at Harvard on campus. There was one black person per entryway in my dorm. We were very clearly distributed by the dean's office. And the white parent, the parents of my white roommates treated my mother like the help the entire time. And this was like, I knew my mother as this fierce black feminist activist, and to see my mom treated that way, I had just never seen anything like that. And so for me, that moment was also, I think what I read was your first time really witnessing your mom have one of those moments where you talk about, she thought that she was friends with them.
She thought she was friends with them. And it had taken a lot for her to get to that place because she grew up in the Jim Crow South, right, where that wasn't even a possibility. And so I think for her to think that, first of all, we didn't get to sleep at anybody's house. My parents just did. So the fact that I got to sleep over was because she thought this was her friend. And so then she felt like, oh, you're never going over there again because I don't know, And it was the first time for me to see her have that experience, which at that young age was deeply, deeply impactful.
So I think the extraordinary thing about this chapter and this story is that and the writing, is that I still came out of that chapter with like a very nerdy question about mulberries.
Yes.
I'm a particle physicist, so this is super not my wheelhouse. I just want to say that off the bat for the audience. How is it that mulberry is important for silk and also pie? This is, I was wondering, do you ever think about that? And I was wondering,
I'm gonna tell you, I do think
the silkworms like what we like?
That I was about to say,
happening?
because the silkworms are attracted to the same compound in that they have good taste, just like we have good taste. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that. Okay.
Some of the same chemicals.
Right now. Okay.
Yeah.
And so before I ask my next question, we're coming up on the time when I hope the audience will ask questions. So If you think you might have a question and you would like to start writing it down to remind yourself, please try to keep it in question format and less comment format so we can get as many in as possible. So I guess like sticking with the kind of nerdy things that came up, I was wondering if there was, so I had like in the edge of space time while I was working on it, I had like things that I was just like, I really, thank you. April 7th.
Yes.
Is
so good.
Is there were things that I was like, I'm just including this and the reader's gonna have to live with it. Is there like a nerdy tree fact where you were like, I will build a whole section for this, or there's something that I just really need to tell people about?
Oh, is there such, well, you know, in some ways, to be honest with you, there's a story in the mulberry chapter about Princess Xi, who got really excited about mulberry because basically a pod fell into her tea and then it unraveled and she saw all the iridescence. So I study light, right? And I was like, that was a beautiful moment where the silk produced by the plant and the light. And I remember my editor said, do we need like this thing in the middle of this chapter? I said, do you know how cool that is? That the silk industry started because light hit the silk fiber in tea? And yes! And she said, okay. And when someone said to me, I was so excited to read the fact about the princess, I said, please send that to me in an email because I'm going to forward that to Retha Power. So it's those kind of facts that could have come out. It had nothing to do with African American history or my own story, but it had to do with my science and this fascination with light and the things that we can see when light interacts with them.
So I'm wondering if there were any darlings that you had to kill. Is there anything that you felt like you just couldn't get it into the book that you're saving for the next one? Maybe we can get a preview of the global lessons from plants.
Yeah, so I almost included a chapter in the book on cherry trees because I love cherry blossoms. And there are some fascinating stories around cherry trees that are both personal in terms of interactions I've had with them. But there wasn't a story that linked to the African American history and family as deeply as I would like. And so there are some species of trees that I considered, but once I decided it was at this intersection of science, history, and family stories, there wasn't enough really to pull those in.
So I think you just pointed to, I think, a really interesting question and challenge. I think the pressure on those of us who are Black and do science writing and Black scientists who do science writing is the expectation of having to conform to preconceived notions of what a science book is.
Yes.
That's usually organized around, like, I don't know, Stephen Hawking is the archetype for my field, maybe Richard Dawkins, for better or for worse, for your field. And then also, if we're trying to write to Black audiences who are not written to by a lot of science writers with Black audiences in mind, of saying this is a Black science book for a Black reader, that sometimes there can be a tension of, I feel like I need to make that connection between Black things and the science, and sometimes that connection isn't there besides you embodying a simultaneity in it. And so I'm wondering how you grappled with that in When Trees Testify and also with Lessons from Plants.
Yeah, so I think, you know, for When Trees Testify, I grappled with it because, as I said, there were things that I'd be interested in that didn't fit into the form that I had set for myself. But I never think of that as a problem because I have more books I want to write. I think in Lessons from Plants, even though I remember you were one of the first people to say this is a Black feminist perspective on plant science, I didn't put that out there in that way. It's clear. If you know me and if you know what Black feminist perspectives are. And there were, in that particular book, there were times when I thought, did it feel that it was too sanitized in a way, right? That I was walking away from that. And I realized that I'm the Black feminist writing, so it's always gonna be there, whether it's as in front of your face as it is like When Trees Testify, or if it's the way Black feminists show up in the world, which is how Lessons from Plants. And so I think at some point I just decided to give myself the freedom not to worry about how people are perceiving it, but to do what makes sense. Because when I do what makes sense, I write things like When Trees Testify. And it took me back to early in my career. When I first started writing about how plants could teach us about mentoring, two of the senior faculty in biochemistry said, you got to stop this. You're distracted, and biochemists don't write about this, and you are not being a serious scientist. And when I decided that I am a serious person, I am a scientist, so I'm always a serious scientist by my definition, it freed me not to worry about how other people are seeing it. Other people will judge our work as the writing of Black scientists. And I own that, and yet I also know that this is the writing of brilliant minds. You're brilliant, right? It's the writing of brilliant minds. And one of the things I love, seriously, if you haven't ordered her first book, I don't know what you're even doing, but this book, the thing I love about this book is that I end talking about Sankofa.
I noticed
and
that.
And you open talking about Sankofa, right? Which is this looking back to bring things forward. And I just thought, no matter what people do, we're gonna show up. And Chanda posted online a couple weeks that this is a Black-ass love story to trees. And I just thought, that's what we're gonna do. And so we might as well own it. And someone asked me a long time ago what I would tell a 5-year-old, my 5-year-old or a 5-year-old. And I said that the world needs us exactly as we are, even when it doesn't recognize it, that it needs us that way. And so that's how I'm always gonna show up in my writing.
Damn.
And you do the same, please.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to biologist Beronda Montgomery talking about her book, When Trees Testify.
I think it's time for audience questions, so hopefully there are lots of questions. I want to remind people that we are recording for C-SPAN.
Oh, I'm here yelling Black-ass love stories on C-SPAN. You said it. I'm sorry, yes.
I love the way you talk about roping in your ancestors into this very present moment and not leaving them in any kind of sort of fantastical past, but seeing how they're shaping you in the present day. And I wonder, as a mother, when you look at Nicholas and how he's moving through the world, to what extent is your instinct to shape him, to let all the ancestors through you shape him? And to what extent is your instinct to step back and just sort of let him become the version of himself that he needs to be in the world?
So I will tell you, my instinct is based on something my mother verbalized. And I have always been an odd child compared to all the children in our family. And at some point, my mother said to someone, you know, I realized when my children had a fire in them that didn't look like the fire that was in me, that it's easy to name it as strange fire. And most parents want to stomp out the strange fire and try to get you to be what everyone else has been. And she said that she decided to try to protect the flame and to teach me how to guard the flame and not let the flame destroy me. And I was just saying, I said it to someone at the Radcliffe recently. I know I just said it to my friend Becky before we started. I believe that children show up in the world pretty perfect. And that the goal of the parent is to not ruin that perfection in your home and not to let the world ruin it. So I really want Nicholas to be whatever he has been designed to be so that the ancestors will be proud. We have conversations about what kind of ancestor we want to be. Because you make a decision as in a daily life about what kind of ancestor you want to be. It's not just happenstance. And so we talk about this and we acknowledge, you know, my father, when he passed away, Nicholas was very close to him. So we talk about ancestors are not always these people who you don't know and haven't seen. Some of them are people you lived and loved with. And think about the choices that they made and the contributions that they made to you that make them a good ancestor, and think about that on a daily basis when you're making choices. So I just want to guard his fire and to teach him how to guard it, because it worked pretty good when my mom did it for me.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question building on the conversation around how you weave together the personal and scientific and historical narrative so beautifully. And I'm a plant ecologist and a sociological researcher, and so in this kind of interdisciplinary space. And one difference, I think, between kind of like traditional ecology and the more sociological stuff is this intentional reflexivity or like a critical interrogation of our own positionality and history of when we come to the science, as opposed to the kind of stricter notion of objectivity and impartiality. And so I'm curious about whether that's come up for you, like in the science as well that you do, of weaving together, thinking about kind of the personal and the historical in the science that you do, or if that's a direction we should be going, or just kind of what you think about that tension in other domains beyond kind of the writing that you do.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm thinking about my colleague over here, Anne Sophie's work, right, where we're thinking about the human who do the science and the science itself. So I've never been really good at completely believing the idea that you walk into the lab or whatever your research space is and you leave kind of yourself at the door. I think the idea of objectivity is subjective. And one of the best things that happened to me was supposed to be a barrier to my success in science and academia, and that's that no one in my family had ever done this before. And so people will say, well, you know, that's people who've had professors as parents kind of know how the system works. Because I didn't know how the system worked, I imagined that I could just make the system work for me. And so I can point to places in my science that have been impacted by the personal. It's also been impacted by relationships. So one of the things that was critically important for me is that if a student or a junior colleague came to me with an idea they were curious about and I could support them in doing it, I wouldn't talk them out of it. I say, let's just take it forward and see where it goes. Some of the biggest breakthroughs we had are because of those kinds of things. So I think that when we teach ourselves that science is only objective, we fall into this trap of thinking that people, we kind of mold people into versions of ourselves. We lose a lot. We keep redoing the same things over and over and layering versions of that. And so we have like the marble with 100 layers, but it's still the same thing in the middle. So I wish that we would understand that we bring our whole selves to science, and that sets up the ways that we ask questions. It sets up the ways that we mentor each other. It sets up who we hire. So I think that the more we can lean into that, the better our science will be, and the better it will be not just for us, but for the planet. And so I just don't fall into those notions because I've seen where it leads us, and it's not very good in some cases.
Other questions? Okay, while you all are thinking, can we talk about that fire you started?
Yes.
Inquiring minds want to know what happened.
So I was doing an experiment. My sister Renee, who's 3 years older than me, was supposed to be my research assistant, which basically meant she was supposed to look out for mom, right? So for the longest time, I had been trying to figure out if you cut in the exact same size, different kinds of paper, toilet paper, paper towel, construction paper, paper from, and you set them on fire all at the same time, which one would burn fastest? So I had my hypothesis. I had a way of timing it, and Renee was supposed to help me light some of them, so we got them all started at the same time, and then she was supposed to look out for mom. Well, something happened, and several of them fell off.
And one
of them fell into the trash can. I didn't set up and so then there was smoke, and then I looked up, Renee was gone. I couldn't find Renee, and then mom came. And it was very challenging, and I almost didn't become a scientist after that. But instead, you know, it's funny how I always say that parents also have revisionist history. My mom now says, well, if I had known you were doing an experiment, it probably wouldn't have been a problem. I'm like, that is revisionist history now that I have all these awards.
I mean, it is, I guess, I was kind of curious about that because also it is this moment where you're burning tree products, right?
Yes, I hadn't come to love the trees as much as then. I was freeing the ancestors' breath.
Speaking of revisionist history.
Revisionist history. Yeah.
We have a question back here? Okay.
Hello, thank you. This is really great, really interesting. This question is, I hope this is an okay question and not too annoying. So I have 3 kids. I have 2 boys and a girl. I have boys are 13 and 8, and my daughter is 6. And what are some good ways to get them exposed and interested in this type of field and information and everything? I mean, besides the book, obviously the book is part of that, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think one of the things, if you can get them in front of people who are doing science and are excited about it. So I have always done lots of visiting elementary schools, going to the library to read books. And sometimes I think even just seeing the possibility model, right, that there is this woman who looks like me with curls like mine who's a professor. So trying to find those opportunities where they can see possibility models, but also finding opportunities where they get to just explore their curiosity. Mm-hmm. So science museums, where they get to do these hands-on types of things. A lot of times they get the message, particularly girls, that they can't do science and math. And so finding opportunities where they're doing it naturally. Like when my son was young and he noticed that there were holes in all the acorns, he's like, what's happening here? I was like, that's a science question. Let's write it down. What's your hypothesis? So just showing them that they do this all the time, just through their natural working of their brain, and then finding ways where they can see possibility models of people who've gone from those asking curious questions as kids to making a career out of it in a way, in any way I think are helpful trajectories to try to help.
We have one over here.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much, Beronda. I'm so excited to read this book. I wanted to ask, given that I have not yet read it, I imagine you discuss it more in the book, but you mentioned briefly learning about tree names from your grandparents, and how you knew what were the correct names when the camp counselors are out here just kind of making things up. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship too, and about that education, because I think that there's so many ways many of us learn about ecologies, like through ancestral knowledge, and also just through like regular mundane intimate relationships with land that a lot of our people have, and that precedes the United States surely, but also precedes like formal education and those things, right? And sometimes there's this assumption that when we go to school or we're learning about science or about something else, like that's where we're being introduced, but in fact we might have these more intimate relationships with that knowledge just based off of use, right?
Yes.
And like what's passed down generationally. And so I just wondered if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about in the book how my parents grew up in the rural part of the Delta region of Arkansas. So whenever we would go and spend time with my grandparents, we were out in nature. And if it was just walking from one place to the other, we would hear, that's the tree that your dad kissed your mom at, right? And so trees were a part of kind of family histories, but then we would also see that those two trees will help you find your way home, because you see that sycamore with the white bark. When you see that, you walk towards it, past it. So they're also landmarkers, but as you're learning that they're important to navigate the space, you're learning their names. And as I was talking to somebody earlier this week actually about, if it wasn't the real name or the scientific name, they sometimes had other names, like you might have a nickname in your family. And that's still a loving way of acknowledging the tree, right? So this was the rope swing tree. We don't know what kind it is, but it's the one that has these very good branches for hanging the rope swing. And so it was just navigating the space that we would learn, but we would also learn which ones we could eat the berries of and which ones were not ever to be eaten. So there was always this full cultural knowledge of the trees, how they interacted with our lives, how they help us know where we were physically in space, and which ones provided nourishment. And so I think just spending time outside in that way was important. So I tried to spend a lot of time with my son outside when he was young. And in fact, even when he was a teenager and that one game was so popular, is it called like Pokemon Go or something, like where you used to go? I made his friends play a version where we went and they had to identify the trees. And his friends would always just kind of amuse me, because we always ended with ice cream or pizza or something. So they're like, just go along with it until she's done. But I think you have to find ways to help us understand that trees are not just the background to our life. I always say to people, do you know how many trees are on your property? Most people can't even tell you how many actual trees they have on their property. And those are their neighbors and kin living there with them. So I talk about many different ways in which we engage with them in the book. Yeah. I have 33, by the way, at my property at home.
Do we have any last burning questions? Yeah.
You spoke about. Thank you. You spoke about earlier walking into rooms authentically. I want to ask now, as a young adult, like entering, the post-grad world, what advice would you give to yourself as a young woman to walk into these, next spaces, next places, like authentically?
I'll give two quick ones. One of them is that a lot of spaces invite us to perform legitimacy. And then that shows up in the language you choose. It shows up in the clothes you wear. It shows up in how you comport yourself. And when you decide that you're legitimate before you walk into the space, my grandmother used to say, you belong wherever your feet take you. You don't have to perform legitimacy. It will free you. The other thing that I will say is that a lot of spaces like to pay us in affirmation. And what changed my life is when I decided to show up in spaces fully affirmed because of who I am, because of my family and friends, and then to go into those spaces and function from affirmation, not for it. That also frees you not to perform in a way. And it also, then you demand that people pay you in the currency that's meaningful to you, not affirmation. So those are two things that I still practice on a daily basis. I will not perform legitimacy. And I also always try to show up fully affirmed and function from that. That's in service to my ancestors and others, not for the affirmation of people who, many of them don't fully know you, may not even like you, and yet want you to perform for their affirmation. That's not a good thing to do.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to Afterwards from C-SPAN. You can watch more conversations with authors like this one every Sunday on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. Book TV and all the C-SPAN networks are now available to watch live on YouTube TV. Learn more at tv.youtube.com. And next week on Afterwards, a discussion on the applications of AI in healthcare with Dr. Robert Watcher. He's the chairman of the Department of Medicine at UC San Francisco, and his book is titled A Giant Leap: How AI is Transforming Healthcare and What That Means for Our Future.